This is the Extra Point Podcast. During this podcast, we will dive deeper into our Sunday teaching and share practical next steps for your faith journey. Now, let's kick off the Extra Point.
Hey, welcome to the Extra Point. I'm Cheryl Ross, the Next Steps and Discipleship Pastor here at Southridge Church, and I'm with Scott Beha, our lead pastor. We are in another week of our series, Red Letters, where we're learning from the teachings of Jesus. And before I go any deeper into that, let me make sure that if you have not liked or subscribed to this podcast, that you do so. That way you don't miss out on any new content. Now, Pastor Scott, you shared from somewhat used some current event stuff and some things that we might have seen during our week last week, based off from the eclipse, to help us really understand and make sure that we are knowledgeable in not just the Word of God, but to be able to take things that are set out there that we might see or hear and be able to not be afraid or have any kind of dealings that are not true, which was really phenomenal. But if you did not listen to that, make sure that you go back and listen to that, because this is going to be just a little deeper from that. And if you missed it, you're not going to know exactly what we're talking about. So let's start with false prophets. You mentioned them in your sermon, and a lot of people, it's not something we talk about a whole lot or probably understand. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I wanted to make a point Sunday because there are people who make a living off of peddling fear, and they personally gain from it. That was my target audience when I was making the comments about false prophets. I'm not talking about people that disagree with me theologically. I'm not talking about people that have made genuine efforts to study the Bible and understand the Bible, but have come to different conclusions or even wrong conclusions. I'm not saying that whatsoever. I'm saying these people out on television, on social media, traveling the church circuit, come in and ask for whatever that is, and they stand to personally profit from your fear of needing to hear their message, and they say that it's from God. It's those people that I say, when they make a prediction and they say this is from God and it doesn't come true, you label them a false prophet and you move on from them. So again, I'm not saying that you label your enemies or people that see different theological distinctions differently than you. There's all kinds of ways that we can genuinely study the Bible, come to different conclusions on certain secondary topics. That doesn't make someone a false prophet.
Right.
But, for instance, if you're on television and you say, God told me this is going to happen, and it doesn't come to pass, or you write a book about something that's going to happen and it doesn't come to pass, then we should then be leery of you. And I would stop all support. I would stop watching the videos. I would turn the channel. I wouldn't send another offering or whatever it is that they're trying to get you to do. That's really who I'm talking about. So there's a sense in which you could kind of weaponize what was said and go oh, well, just anyone that disagrees. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people that are literally trying to prey on people to profit from them and their fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of those kind of secondary topics was talking about the rapture. You mentioned that in your sermon and how that's not necessarily what we believe. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, and this would be one of those areas where I go, all right, if you see it differently than me, that's fine. I'm not this is eschatology, meaning the study of the end times, is a secondary, maybe even a tertiary issue.
Right.
It doesn't matter. It's going to happen one way or another. We need to agree on the main things. But the doctrine of the rapture, the reason why I want to preach consistently against it is not to shame people for what they were brought up to believe or anything like that, but it's simply because, again, of the fear that is being peddled in regards to that.
Right.
That there is so much misunderstanding. People that literally, when we say that we're going to preach from Revelation, people that are literally I don't want to listen to that. I don't want any part of that. I don't even want to come.
Yeah.
When you're doing that, you say anything about the end times or anything. I mean, people, especially people of my generation, we grew up in the Left Behind series, where we had youth group leaders and pastors and parents that literally traumatized us with, or even the generation before us, they grew up with the Thief in the Night series, and I go, here's the deal. You can come to your own conclusions on the rapture. I mean, I did a whole series on it, why I don't think that it's a biblical doctrine whatsoever, but it's just it's one of those deals. You go, I don't see the necessity of it. But again, if you believe it, that's fine. But if you are listening to people that were predicting last Monday as the rapture because of an eclipse, you need to turn the channel, right? Even if you're a rapture doctrine type person, you still need to understand that Matthew 24:36 says, "No one knows the time or the hour when the Son of Man will return." Like, still lean back on that, and you can be a rapture person, but you can also do it in a reasonable way to where you're not trying to sit here and calculate years and stars and suns and moons and all of this wars and everything to try to figure out when it's going to happen, because that is a fool's errand.
Right.
And you don't want to be in the prophet, or you don't want to be in the false prophet camp. Because of your eschatology. Like, you can have that eschatology and have a very reasonable outlook on, okay, I still believe this, but I'm not sitting here I want to be just faithful to the Lord until it happens.
Yes, absolutely.
Even though I don't think it's going to happen. If that's your view, just be faithful to the Lord till you think it's going to happen.
Right, absolutely.
So
and I think that's the point. Like, that's the point for those texts that people get that from, is to just be faithful to God. And
yeah, but I mean, I even called it out. Like the passage right after 24:36 in Matthew 37-41 is where most folks get their doctrine of the rapture. It's one of them. It's 1 Thessalonians 4, and then it's this passage right here, and it's like, if you look at the Luke's parallel of Matthew 24, it's very clear that this is talking about something drastically different, and it's also very clear that Jesus sets the context of Matthew 24, says it's going to be like that in Noah's day, and it's like, well, in Noah's day, God didn't come and sweep away all of the righteous people. He swept away the unrighteous people. So clearly there's something else going on there. And that whole talk of, two men walking up a hill, one's going to it's illustrating what he had just said about it was like that in the times of the flood.
Right.
It's again, if you go looking for it, you see that text, you go, boom, there it is. Now I'm justified in my rapture doctrine. If you are just trying to be true to the text, not carry a presupposition into it, I don't know that you would come, if you tell me that without any presupposition, somebody would read Matthew 24 and come to the idea that at one day God is just going to disappear every Christian on the face of the earth, whether they're driving a car, whether they're flying a plane, whatever they're doing, he's just going to disappear all of them. If you think that you can get to that all on your own by just simply reading Matthew 24, you are out of your mind.
Yeah.
Right? You're just not going to come. That's not the conclusion you're going to come to whatsoever. And that's my issue with that. The only way you get there in that passage is because you brought it with you to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of reading the text and really having maybe some context about the text, this is how we can help understand the Bible better, to understand that it was written for us but not to us. When we understand who it was written to, then that gives us context to help us better understand it.
Yes.
And know what it's saying.
Yeah, the reason why people were predicting all these wild things about the eclipse is because they're trying to find meaning in their day on a document that was written 2,000 years ago. It's the same, honestly. So the rapture doctrine comes from the dispensationalists. The same way that they come to all of their wild conclusions about their eschatology is because they are reading everything in light of their current generation rather than the generation that it was written to.
Right.
Which is it's just a very... I don't know. It's an inappropriate way of reading the Bible to not understand that you're a secondary audience, and so therefore to try to infer meaning. This is why, there's a place in Revelation that talks about the locust, and dispensationalists, not all of them, but some of them, have throughout the years said, "Oh, those are Apache helicopters." The way that they got to that is well, it has to mean something in my day.
Yeah.
So what could a big think of locusts going and tearing up all this. What could that mean? Oh, that's probably helicopters. And you go, just think for a second. You really, you would not get there unless you brought that with you. That's just not a wise way to read the Bible. And so if you go to Matthew 24, where Jesus is giving these different things, and he talks about suns and moons, or whatever it is, and you're looking for it, then yeah, you're going to find it, but you wouldn't get there on your own. Like you have to realize when Jesus was talking here in Matthew 24, he is speaking to the leaders of Israel. He's speaking to the Jewish leaders about the condemnation on them for the rejection of him. That's the context. If you get something different, like, it can't mean an eclipse in 2024, because then Jesus is just spouting nonsense to the Jewish leaders of his day. It's just, it means nothing at that point when we go, no, Jesus was talking 2,000 years ago about an eclipse. That now that here we are 7 days, 8 days later, that nothing, like, we're all still here. The world didn't come to an end. And it's like the folks that every time there's a war somewhere, like, everyone's going to start posting, there will be wars and rumors of wars, and goes, why don't you know that that's about the battle that took place in AD 66 to AD 70? Why are more churches not teaching that? Because that's clearly what Jesus was talking about, because he literally just said that he's going to destroy the temple. He literally just said that at the beginning of Matthew 24. He set the whole context. How did we get to something else? And the way that you get there is you read that passage in light of your own generation rather than the generation that it was written to. And you have to realize that you can gain meaning from the Bible. It can tell you everything you need to know about faith and God and Jesus and the whole shebang. I'm a big Bible person. It was not written to us. I am not the original audience, and so therefore I have to go and do the hard work of figuring out what it meant for the first century audience that it was written to, and then draw the conclusions on what that means for my life. And if I will do that, if I will use those guardrails, I will not end up in these wild, like, unnecessary theological and doctrinal areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you talked about within the sign of Jonah, it talks about how he was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, 3 nights. Let's dig deeper into that a little bit and what that means for how it says that it'll also be for the Son of Man.
Yeah, I tried to handle this in first service, and I just destroyed it. It was terrible. So I removed it for second service and thought, that's probably better on the extra point, because you'll have, what I wanted to get to is there's critics that read the passage here and go, well, Jesus didn't even know what he was talking about, because he said he would be in, just like Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale. He's going to be in the heart of the earth 3 days, 3 nights. And he goes, well, if you can count, you can count. He was in the tomb late Friday, Friday night, Saturday, early Sunday morning. It's not 3 days and 3 nights. And the answer, there's 2 issues there. The first issue is we now have to defend that if we choose to be as literal as possible in areas that most likely weren't meant to be literal. Right? Clearly, there was truth in what Jesus was saying. He was talking about his resurrection. That is a way of saying, I'm going to be in the tomb for 3 days. Right? It's 3 days and 3 nights. What does he mean by that? He means 3 days. Right? So that's the first thing. If you want to press every single thing in the Bible to be as literal as possible, then the opponents of Christianity then can very easily just wipe your feet out from under you. And you don't have a leg to stand on. Which is why, like, I was talking to people about this recently, and they said that they grew up in churches that were, like, talking about that week Jesus died was a high Sabbath, so therefore it was actually there was like an extra special Sabbath, like 2 Sabbaths in 1 week, which the Jewish scholars will tell you that never happened in the history of it. Never happened. But what they try to do is they go, well, it was another one on Friday that week, so therefore all of everything on Holy Week actually started on Wednesday. Jesus was arrested Wednesday night. He was killed Thursday, so he's in the Thursday night, all day Friday, all day Saturday. That gets you to your 3 days, 3 nights for him to raise on Sunday morning.
That's wild.
Again, when you want to press the text, to be as literal as possible when that's not even necessary. That's the kind of wild stuff.
Right.
It's the same thing. When you want to press Matthew 24, sure, you can get to wild stuff like raptures and all sorts of different stuff, but it's not necessary if you will understand the context of which this is happening. Jesus is simply telling these people, the only sign you're going to get is going to be my resurrection, when I raise on the third day.
Yeah.
Why did he say it 3 days, 3 nights? Well, for the Jews, the way that they reckon time is different than the way that us Westerners do.
Yeah.
When we talk about time, we talk about 24-hour days.
Yeah.
That's what we're thinking. We're very linear in that fashion. Well, the way the Hebrews, the Israel reckon time was not like that. They would consider the day to begin when the sun went down the night before. And so when Jesus is thinking 3 days, he goes, well, Friday afternoon he's in the tomb, so therefore that day for him, in the way that the Jews reckon time, started on Thursday night.
Yeah.
And then you have the rest. And then he's up early on Sunday, but even though because it was a portion of the day Sunday, they still counted it as part of the third day.
Yeah.
It's always saying they reckon time differently. There's even an instance in the book of Esther where she calls for a 3-day fast.
Yes.
So why do they not fast 3 full days before she shows up? She shows up on the third day. It's just the way that they reckon time.
Yeah.
Right? And so I did a horrible job of explaining that because that's not something that should make it into a sermon.
Right.
It's probably better for this.
Yeah.
But that's it. It's like, first off, we press everything to be literal because we, especially here in the Bible Belt, most of us were raised fundamentalists, which was simply a reaction to the Enlightenment period that tried to question everything. And that's not serving the church very well whatsoever, and it's also not historic Christianity. So therefore, we don't need to do that. And then second, we just need to understand that the Jews just reckon time differently. And so there's no conflict in the text with what Jesus is saying.
Yeah.
It'd be the same as Jonah says 3 days and 3 nights. We don't actually know, though, given the fact that they reckon time differently than us, what time did he actually get swallowed by a whale? You just can't, he's clearly just using language to let you know what's getting ready to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what kind of evidence do we have to really support the resurrection?
Yeah, this is one, again, I cut a lot of this in second service because it just went over horribly in the first service. But, because the point was, you do have to take the resurrection on faith, but it's not blind faith.
Right.
Right. It's not like I'm just asking you to believe something wild like the rapture. No,
right.
That's a joke. Come on, that's the joke. It's not blind faith though, because there are the resurrection of Jesus has very good post extra biblical reasons, and it's not even just the Gospels that people go to, but some critics of Christianity will say, "Oh, you can't use the Gospels." As well, it's like, why? Those are really reliable early sources that, if they were false, would have never gained the popularity that they did.
Right.
First off, there would have been people, because they were all written during the time eyewitnesses were still around. People would have just gone and went like, "No, I was there. That didn't happen."
Right.
That all of that was easily refuted. Plus, now we have 2,000 years worth of archaeology that they could come up with some sort of rebuttal against it. Not one archaeological find has ever disproved anything in the New Testament. Luke was a fantastic historian. Everything that he wrote about in his chronological gospel has been found to be true. Thus far in the archaeological record, not one single contradiction. Everything has had its place. And so to try to, first off, to discount the Gospels is silly. They are reliable historical documents from eyewitnesses and people very, very close to the source. And one of the reasons why I find them to be so reliable is the fact that it was women who were the first people to ever speak of the resurrection of Jesus. That would have never taken place in the first century. If you were trying to start a new religion based on a lie, that would not be your cover story. It wouldn't be like, oh, these ladies that nobody trusts anyways, which I mean, how in the world got into that shape is kind of weird, but whatever. But no, they didn't, the word of a woman wouldn't hold up in court most likely. So therefore, you wouldn't go and take the people that society in that time looked down upon and didn't trust the word of and all this. You wouldn't let them be your keynote witness in your lie. That would never happen. You would choose Peter. You would choose these prominent men. The other thing is to get this idea that when Jesus is arrested on Thursday night and all the disciples scatter and are, by all accounts, just huddled up in a house somewhere, thinking that they're next, overcome by fear, for them to be as brazen as they were after the resurrection would only happen if the resurrection was true, only if they really did see the risen Christ.
Right.
Because at the point that a lie is going to cost you your life, you're going to give up the lie. Right? Like if you tell your kids that you know they're lying, you go, listen, here's what's going to happen if I catch you lying. Here's what's going to happen if you tell me the truth. You're just going to go, all right, I'll tell you the truth, whatever.
Yeah.
You won't pay massive consequences for a lie. You just won't do it. And they paid massive. I mean, we know at least 11 of them were martyred for their faith, and then a 12th, John, was eventually sentenced to the Isle of Patmos to just live out his days there. Then you even get Paul ends up being a martyr. Stephen ends up being a martyr. These people don't offer their lives up for a lie. It's nonsensical to try to think that. Not to mention, it's very clear in the gospel records that the ladies followed, after the crucifixion, followed Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus to the tomb. They knew where it was. And tombs like that would have been venerated. They would have been celebrated. They would have been decorated. All this stuff. They would have made a shrine to Jesus if they knew where he was. Without a doubt. It's not one of those things where you just go oh my goodness, I can't believe I don't know which tomb it was. That's not the case. And even to this day, that when you go to Israel, they will show you two different tombs because they don't, and truthfully, they don't even know which one of those two, if those two, either one of them could even be it.
Yeah.
Because the tomb, if the tomb was not empty, all the Romans had to do, all the religious leaders had to do was to go and show the body.
Right.
And they gave up on the story that the disciples stole the body really fast. Nobody anywhere believes that story at all anymore. But people have tried to make all kinds of wild accusations to get around it. How do we get away from the truth of the resurrection? One of the main ideas that Islam and different folks have about is that Jesus never really died. He was just kind of beaten and bloodied and crucified, and they pulled him off the cross too soon. But the truth of the matter is the American Medical Association actually did a full review on what was said to be done to Jesus, and they said, no, there's nobody whatsoever survives that. And second off, the Romans were killing machines. They did it for a living. They were probably the best in history.
Yeah.
They didn't accidentally take a guy down before he was dead.
Yeah.
The other proof, John even says this in his gospel, he saw white liquid come out before blood when the spear went into the ribs of Jesus. That's what happens when you're dead.
Wow. Yeah.
So, the medical evidence is there. People have tried to say, the appearances of Jesus were hallucinations. The problem is that one time, 1 Corinthians 15 tells us that Jesus appeared to over 500 people at one time.
Right.
You can't have mass hysteria like that. That's not possible. They actually, Lee Strobel even went and tried, whenever he was writing the case for Christ, tried to go and disprove it. And people that study stuff like that. Whatever I just said. Sorry.
Starts with an H.
It's not.
Hallucinations.
Hallucinations. That's not possible.
Right.
And it would be wild that all of the disciples were having the same hallucination.
Right.
It's not how it works whatsoever. Other good evidence. James, the brother of Jesus, thought that Jesus was crazy, as evidence throughout different times. When Jesus' brothers are talked about in the Gospels, it's normally they are not on the same page with Jesus whatsoever. And then in that 1 Corinthians passage, it tells us that James was one of them that Jesus appeared to personally. And then James goes on to be a leader, what Paul calls him a pillar in the church there in Jerusalem. And then he goes on to write a letter that we have collected into our New Testament as inspired scripture that names Jesus as James's Lord.
Right.
That is wild evidence. The Apostle Paul's conversion, because he saw the risen Jesus. He was killing Christians, wanted to stop. What would cause someone to go from killing Christians and wanting to imprison them and completely stomp them out to being the biggest church planter and literature writer of the day? Like, what would cause someone to do that? No one would do that for a lie. So even though, yes, you take the resurrection on faith, I'm just telling you, it's not blind faith whatsoever. And opponents of Christianity that try to make it out like that's not really compelling evidence, at the very least. It may not convince you. I'm not saying that it convinces you. But what I'm saying is I think and the whole point of the sermon was, I think there is enough to actually convince you. I think most people choose not to be convinced because the cost of being convinced. Yeah. And that's what we were ultimately talking about, is those 4 things right at the end. Yeah. If you're convinced, you have to move past your need to see signs and wonders. You have to move past your need actually to need anything from God whatsoever. Because when you're convinced of the crucifixion and the resurrection, when you're convinced of that, you're also convinced that Jesus is king. And the king does not serve your needs. You serve his needs. When you're convinced, you move to that place in your life where you go, okay, God, I am fine with whatever the answer is. Whether it makes me miserable, whether it breaks my heart, or whether it's the greatest joy of my life, I'm okay with whatever the king says. Yeah. Not many people ever get there in their life. That's why studies showed that only like 8% of most churches are actually Christians. Yeah. Number 2, they have to repent and start fresh. Not just start new religious habits, like you have to decide that the stuff that you were doing, the life that you were living, is actually wrong, it's sinful, and turn from it and start over. Just like the people of Nineveh did when Jonah went and preached. Yeah. The 3rd thing, you have to seek God's wisdom. That means that God's word becomes the blueprint for how you see the world in every single situation whatsoever. Like if you're trying to figure out, here we are in an election season. You're trying to figure out, okay, which one of these folks, what they stand for most closely, not aligns with your opinion, but aligns with God's view for the world. Yeah. God's word. Like that's it. So it's no longer your opinion and who you're affiliated with. Yeah. That's what happens when you're convinced of the resurrection. You will take uncomfortable truths that you wish were different and make them your truth. Yeah. Because that's what the king said. And what the king says is what goes. The 4th thing is submit to the new master. That little story at the end about an evil spirit going out, and he comes back, sees the house is all clean, but it's not filled. There's not a new master in charge. So he goes and gets his buddies and comes back, and the person ends up even worse off. Clearly he was talking about Israel there, and how no matter how many times they try to reform Israel, things just keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And the problem was they were rejecting the new master. Right. They were rejecting Jesus. And that's what, for us, you can't just remove some bad habits from your life and replace them with some good habits. Because eventually, and I'm telling you, eventually those bad habits will come back and they will be worse. But if you put someone else in charge, you have a new master of the house, that's when true transformation takes place. Yeah. So the resurrection, I think, is historically one of the most verifiable events to ever take place. But most people will not be convinced of it because what it will cost them. It will cost them a full submission to the one who was resurrected. Absolutely.
Well, that's great. And some good practical next steps for you in those last 4 points. We look forward to being here again next week to share more from our Red Letter series and give you more practical next steps for your faith journey.
Thanks for tuning in to The Extra Point. Be sure to subscribe to the Southridge Church podcast and tune in every Wednesday for another episode of The Extra Point.